December 17, 1944. Snow had been falling all morning, soft and steady, the kind that muffled sound and erased footprints almost as soon as they were made. In a small Belgian field near Malmedy, it settled on helmets, shoulders, and the backs of greatcoats, turning a place of war into something almost quiet. 84 American soldiers stood together in that snow. They were no longer fighting. Their weapons were gone. Their hands were empty. They had done what soldiers are taught to do when the battle is lost. They surrendered, trusting the oldest rule of war, that captivity meant survival. Around them stood men in SS uniforms, rifles slung, engines idling nearby. Orders had been shouted, but none that sounded like death. The Americans waited. Some stamped their feet to keep warm. Others glanced at the road, expecting trucks, camps, time to pass. This was supposed to be the moment after fear. Then something changed. No warning was given. No explanation followed. In a matter of seconds, the line between soldier and prisoner, between command and crime, vanished entirely. What unfolded in that field would echo far beyond the Ardennes, far beyond December 1944, and far beyond the war itself. Because this was not a clash of armies. It was not a battle lost or won. It was a decision. A decision made under pressure, shaped by ideology, and carried out with finality. A decision that transformed uniformed men into victims, and officers into criminals under international law. In the frozen silence of that Belgian field, the war revealed one of its darkest truths, that surrender does not always save you, and that the greatest danger is not chaos, but obedience without restraint. This is the story of how one SS commander crossed that line, and how 84 American prisoners paid the price. What happened near Malmedy was not a rumor born of chaos, nor a story exaggerated by grief or anger. It was documented, investigated, testified to under oath. The killing of 84 American prisoners of war became one of the clearest, most undeniable war crimes committed on the Western Front. And it changed everything. Before that winter, Allied soldiers had faced the Waffen-SS as a feared enemy, but still as soldiers bound, at least in theory, by the same laws of war. After Malmedy, that illusion was gone. From that moment forward, surrender carried a new uncertainty, and the SS was no longer seen merely as an elite formation, but as something fundamentally different. This film is not about a single burst of battlefield madness. It is about how an entire system can make such an outcome possible. The massacre was not the result of confusion. It was not a split-second mistake made in the fog of war. The men in that field had been disarmed. They were under guard. Time passed. Decisions were made. Orders were followed, or allowed to be followed, without restraint. At the center of it all stood an SS commander who would later be labeled mad. Not mad in the medical sense. Not incoherent or detached from reality. But shaped by a command culture that prized obedience over conscience, ideology over law, and victory over humanity. His actions reflected something deeper than personal cruelty. They reflected a moral distortion produced by doctrine, pressure, and belief. To understand Malmedy, we must look beyond the gunfire and the snow. We must examine the culture of the SS, an organization trained not simply to fight, but to view enemies as expendable obstacles rather than human beings. We must understand the Ardennes offensive itself, a desperate gamble that placed impossible expectations on commanders racing against time, fuel, and collapse. We must confront how the laws of war, written to protect the defeated, can unravel when ideology convinces men that those laws no longer apply. And we must follow what came next. The aftermath did not end in that frozen field. Survivors escaped. Witnesses spoke. Investigators reconstructed the crime piece by piece. And for one SS commander, the decisions made in minutes would be judged over years, in courtrooms where obedience was no longer an excuse. This story will not glorify violence. It will not reduce its subjects to caricatures of monsters or heroes. It will present only what can be documented, what can be shown, and what must be remembered. Because Malmedy was not an accident of war. It was a warning about what happens when ideology replaces restraint, and when command forgets that even in war there are lines that must never be crossed. To understand how 84 American prisoners could be executed in cold blood, one must first understand the institution that produced the men who stood over them with loaded weapons. The Waffen-SS was not simply another German fighting force. From its inception, it was designed to be something different. Unlike the regular Wehrmacht, which traced its traditions back to the old Prussian army, the SS was born from ideology. Loyalty to Adolf Hitler came first. Military professionalism came second. Moral restraint came last, if it came at all. Recruits were screened not just for physical fitness, but for political reliability. They were taught that they were not merely soldiers, but guardians of a worldview. From the beginning, this distinction mattered. SS training emphasized absolute obedience and aggressive initiative. Orders were to be carried out decisively, without hesitation or moral debate. The enemy was not simply to be defeated, but broken. Mercy was not a virtue. Ruthlessness was. By the time the war reached its later years, this mindset had hardened. The Waffen-SS had fought on the Eastern Front, where the war had become a brutal struggle without restraint. There, the line between combat and atrocity had long since vanished. Prisoners were often treated as liabilities, civilians as obstacles. Survival depended on speed, aggression, and a willingness to do what others would not. When SS units were transferred west, they did not leave that culture behind. By late 1944, Germany was losing the war. Its armies were retreating on every front. Cities lay in ruins. Fuel was scarce. Experienced troops were dead or wounded. What remained was a force under immense pressure, expected to achieve the impossible with diminishing resources. It was in this atmosphere that the Ardennes offensive was conceived. The plan itself was audacious to the point of fantasy. A massive surprise attack through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. A rapid drive to the Meuse River. The capture of Allied fuel depots. The splitting of British and American armies. A negotiated peace from a position of renewed strength. For the commanders tasked with executing it, failure was not an option. Success was demanded, regardless of cost. SS units were placed at the spearhead of the offensive. They were chosen not because they were the most disciplined, but because they were believed to be the most aggressive. Speed mattered above all else. Delays were unacceptable. Prisoners were a burden. Every minute lost was fuel burned, momentum wasted, and the entire plan put at risk. These were not abstract concerns. They were drilled into officers and men alike. Among them was Joachim Paper, the commander whose name would become inseparably linked to Malmedy. Young, decorated, and fiercely loyal to the SS ethos, Paper had built his reputation on audacity and uncompromising action. He was admired by his superiors for his willingness to push forward regardless of losses or obstacles. But Paper was also a product of the system that shaped him. He had learned his trade in an organization where success excused excess, and where the enemy was rarely granted the dignity of surrender. His command style emphasized speed, intimidation, and relentless advance. Retreat was failure. Hesitation was weakness. As his Kampfgruppe surged westward in December 1944, it carried these assumptions with it. American units caught in the opening days of the offensive were often overwhelmed. Roadblocks collapsed. Convoys were overrun. Prisoners were taken, not because the SS had planned to manage them, but because the chaos of battle made it unavoidable. What happened to those prisoners depended on circumstance, command climate, and the decisions of officers on the ground. In theory, German soldiers were bound by the Geneva Conventions. In practice, SS troops operated in a gray zone where ideology often overrode law. Orders were not always explicit, but expectations were clear. Prisoners slowed advances. Guards were needed. Vehicles were required. Fuel was consumed. And in the Ardennes, time was everything. The field near Malmedy was not selected for execution. It was simply a place where prisoners were gathered while their captors attempted to decide what to do next. The men who stood shivering in the snow had already survived battle. They had surrendered in good faith. They expected captivity. What they did not know was that they had fallen into the hands of a force uniquely conditioned to view them as disposable. The SS had been designed to function without moral friction. Its officers were trained to act decisively, even brutally, if circumstances demanded it. When orders were unclear, initiative filled the gap. When responsibility was diffuse, accountability vanished. This was not a breakdown of discipline. It was discipline operating exactly as intended. The massacre at Malmedy did not erupt out of sudden panic or accidental gunfire. It emerged from a system that had normalized violence beyond the battlefield, that had taught its leaders to value mission above law, and that had stripped the enemy of human status long before the first shot was fired in that snowy field. By the time the prisoners were assembled, the conditions for catastrophe were already in place. The ideology had been taught. The command culture had been reinforced. The desperation of the offensive had removed restraint. All that remained was a decision. And once that decision was made, the consequences would echo far beyond the Ardennes, into courtrooms, into history, and into the collective memory of a war that would forever be defined not just by how it was fought, but by how its victims were treated when the fighting stopped. When the Ardennes offensive began in the early hours of December 16, 1944, it achieved what German planners had hoped for most: surprise. American lines cracked under the sudden weight of artillery and armored thrusts. Units were scattered, communications disrupted, and entire road networks thrown into confusion. In the opening days, the battlefield moved faster than doctrine. Orders lagged behind reality. Commanders on both sides were forced to improvise. For the Waffen-SS units driving west, this chaos was not a hindrance. It was an opportunity. Kampfgruppe paper advanced aggressively, seizing crossroads, overrunning supply columns, and capturing isolated American units. The objective was speed above all else. Every delay threatened the fragile timetable of the offensive. Every pause risked allowing Allied air power to return once the weather cleared. Prisoners were an inconvenience in a campaign that allowed no margin for hesitation. At first, American soldiers who surrendered were treated as prisoners in the conventional sense, disarmed, searched, and moved to the rear when possible. But the pace of the advance made this increasingly impractical. Roads were clogged. Fuel trucks were scarce. Guards were needed at the front. The column could not afford to stop. As the hours passed, the number of prisoners grew. Some were left behind under minimal guard. Others were marched along until circumstances forced decisions to be made. In the rigid moral framework of the SS, such decisions did not favor compassion. The enemy was not viewed as a fellow soldier temporarily or to combat, but as a logistical problem to be solved. Meanwhile, violence was escalating along the route of advance. Civilians were shot for suspected resistance. Captured soldiers were threatened or beaten. There were already whispers among American units that surrender to the SS carried risks that surrender to the Wehrmacht did not. These stories spread quickly, amplified by fear and uncertainty. By the time Kampfgruppe paper reached the area near Malmedy, the psychological barrier against killing prisoners had already been weakened. On December 17, elements of the U.S. 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were moving through the area when they encountered advancing SS forces. The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned. After a brief engagement, many were forced to surrender. They were disarmed and gathered in an open field near a crossroads. Witnesses would later recall that the scene did not immediately feel like an execution site. The prisoners stood together, cold and exhausted, uncertain but alive. Guards moved among them. Vehicles passed. Time went by. Then something changed. Accounts differ on what triggered the shooting. Some survivors recalled a single shot. Others described a sudden burst of machine gun fire. What is clear is that once the first rounds were fired, discipline collapsed in a different way, into coordinated violence. Machine guns opened up on the prisoners. Men fell instantly. Others tried to flee. Some dropped to the ground, playing dead as bullets tore through the field. SS troops moved among the bodies, shooting wounded men at close range. The killing was not confined to a moment of confusion. It continued methodically as survivors were hunted down. Those who escaped did so by luck, darkness, or sheer endurance. They crawled through snow, hid among corpses, ran into nearby woods under fire. Many were wounded. Some would later die from exposure or blood loss. But enough survived to tell the story. The massacre was not hidden. Local civilians witnessed its aftermath. American forces recovered the bodies days later. The evidence lay frozen in the field: bullet wounds, clustered corpses, discarded equipment. It was impossible to explain away as a battlefield accident. For Allied troops, the psychological impact was immediate. News of Malmedy spread rapidly through American units. The effect was profound and grim. Many soldiers concluded that surrender to the SS was no longer safe. The rules had changed. Fear replaced restraint. In some sectors, the knowledge of what had happened hardened attitudes on both sides, leading to further brutality as the fighting continued. For the SS, the massacre was not officially acknowledged at the time. There were no immediate court-martials. No public condemnations. The advance pressed on, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But the offensive itself was already faltering. Fuel shortages slowed the columns. Allied resistance stiffened. The weather began to clear, bringing American air power back into the sky. The window of opportunity closed rapidly. As the German advance stalled and then retreated, the consequences of Malmedy followed it. Survivors were interviewed. Statements were collected. Investigators reconstructed the event with painstaking care. Names were recorded. Units identified. Command responsibility traced. What had begun as a field execution became a legal and moral reckoning. The massacre was no longer just a crime against its victims. It was evidence of a deeper failure, of a command culture that had allowed, tolerated, or even encouraged the killing of prisoners in pursuit of speed and ideological goals. In the frozen Ardennes, the boundary between combat and murder had been crossed. And once crossed, it could not be uncrossed. The field near Malmedy would become more than a crime scene. It would become a symbol of what happens when desperation meets doctrine, and when soldiers are taught that victory matters more than humanity. The war would go on. Battles would be won and lost. But for those who stood in that field, and for those who would later judge what happened there, the meaning of Malmedy was already fixed. It was not chaos. It was a choice. The field near the Bognes crossroads did not look like a place where history would pause and take note. It was open ground, lightly sloped, bordered by trees and winter roads. Snow lay unevenly across the frozen earth, trampled by boots and vehicle tracks. On December 17, 1944, it was simply a convenient place to stop, wide enough to gather prisoners, close enough to the road to keep the column moving. For the American soldiers herded into that field, the fighting had already ended. They had done what doctrine and instinct told them to do. Surrounded, outgunned, cut off, they surrendered. Weapons were dropped. Hands were raised. Helmets and gloves were pulled tight against the cold as they waited for what came next. None of them expected freedom. But they expected life. The SS guards who ringed the field did not appear frantic. Vehicles idled nearby. Men moved back and forth, checking equipment, scanning the roads. Time passed slowly. Long enough for hope to settle in. Long enough for fear to dull into numbness. Some prisoners spoke quietly among themselves. Others stared at the ground. A few looked toward the tree line, calculating distances, wondering whether escape was even possible. They had no way of knowing what decisions were being made beyond their sight. Kampfgruppe paper was still pushing west. Every minute mattered. Fuel was running low. Resistance ahead was stiffening. Prisoners were accumulating faster than they could be processed. The column could not afford to slow, and it could not spare men to escort captives to the rear. No written order has ever been found instructing that the prisoners at Malmedy be killed. That is what makes what happened next so revealing. The shooting did not erupt in panic. It did not resemble a sudden ambush or a chaotic exchange of fire. Survivors would later testify that the first shots were isolated, sharp cracks that cut through the cold air and turned heads. Then the machine guns opened up. The burst was immediate and devastating. Men fell in rows. Bodies collapsed into the snow, some lifeless instantly, others screaming, convulsing, reaching for wounds they could not comprehend. The sound was overwhelming, automatic fire echoing off the trees, mingled with shouts, confusion, and terror. Some prisoners dropped flat, instinctively pressing themselves into the ground. Others ran. They ran knowing they were unarmed, knowing they were exposed, knowing the odds were hopeless. But instinct is stronger than logic. SS troops pursued them, firing as they fled. Bullets cut men down mid-stride. Others fell and lay still, feigning death as blood soaked through their uniforms and into the snow beneath them. For those pretending to be dead, the ordeal was not over. Witnesses later described SS soldiers walking among the bodies, firing single shots into those who moved. Boots nudged limbs. Weapons were lowered deliberately. Wounded men were finished at close range. This was not a battlefield accident. It was an execution. One survivor recalled the moment he realized the shooting was not stopping, that it was not a warning or a mistake, but something final. Another remembered lying beneath the weight of a dead comrade, breathing shallowly, praying that his chest would not rise too visibly. Some men were shot multiple times and survived only because the bullets missed vital organs. Others were left for dead, bleeding into the snow as the sound of engines and boots gradually faded. The SS column moved on. They did not remain to bury the bodies. They did not secure the site. They left the field scattered with corpses, weapons, and frozen blood. The mission came first. The dead were an afterthought. As the sounds of the column receded, the field grew quiet again. That was when the survivors began to move. Men who had been lying motionless for minutes, or hours, slowly lifted their heads. Some crawled. Some staggered. Others dragged themselves through the snow, following the tree line, guided by nothing more than the instinct to get away. They moved despite wounds that would have incapacitated them under any other circumstances. Adrenaline carried them forward. Fear drove them on. A few collapsed and died after reaching cover. Others wandered for hours before finding help. Some were recaptured. Some made it back to American lines and collapsed the moment they were safe. Their stories were fragmented, inconsistent in detail, but unanimous in meaning. They had been shot after surrendering. When American units retook the area days later, they found the field as the survivors had described it. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Bullet wounds were clear. The pattern of fire told its own story. There had been no firefight. Investigators photographed the scene. They counted the dead. They examined wounds. They interviewed witnesses. The evidence pointed in one direction, with chilling clarity. 84 American prisoners of war had been deliberately killed. The massacre had an immediate and corrosive effect on the battlefield. American soldiers who learned of Malmedy understood its implication instantly. If surrender was no longer safe, then restraint became a liability. The knowledge hardened attitudes, eroded trust, and intensified an already brutal campaign. For German forces, especially the SS, the massacre became an unspoken burden. Officers knew what had happened. Soldiers talked among themselves. But there was no formal reckoning while the war still raged. That would come later. What makes Malmedy so disturbing is not only the act itself, but how easily it occurred. There was no frenzy, no breakdown of command, no moment where control was visibly lost. The killing unfolded within a structure that allowed initiative without oversight, obedience without conscience, and ideology without limits. The prisoners stood in that field believing the war had paused for them. Instead, they had entered a space where the rules no longer applied. In the snow near Malmedy, the laws of war did not fail because they were unknown. They failed because they were ignored. And once ignored, the consequences could not be contained. The echoes of those gunshots would follow the perpetrators into captivity, into interrogation rooms, into courtrooms where the field was reconstructed word by word, testimony by testimony. The massacre was over in minutes. Its judgment would take years. And its meaning, about power, obedience, and the cost of ideology, would endure long after the last shell fell silent. The killings at Malmedy did not occur because discipline collapsed. They occurred because discipline functioned exactly as the system had trained it to. To understand this, it is necessary to look at how the Waffen-SS was designed to operate on the battlefield, and how those design choices, once strengths, became fatal weaknesses when applied without restraint. One of the defining characteristics of SS combat doctrine was command flexibility. Junior officers and even non-commissioned officers were encouraged to act independently, to seize initiative without waiting for detailed orders. In fast-moving operations, this could be effective. Decisions were made quickly. Momentum was maintained. Opportunities were exploited. But flexibility without firm moral boundaries carries risk. In the SS, initiative was not balanced by a strong culture of legal accountability. Orders were often vague by design, allowing commanders to interpret intent rather than wording. This created plausible deniability upward and unchecked authority downward. When guidance was unclear, ideology filled the gap. Nowhere was this more dangerous than in the handling of prisoners of war. On paper, Germany was a signatory to the Geneva Conventions. In practice, SS units operated with no consistent POW handling protocols during rapid advances. Unlike Allied forces, which emphasized standardized procedures, search, disarm, segregate, evacuate, the SS approach was situational and improvised. Prisoners were handled based on circumstance, convenience, and perceived utility. In a slow-moving defensive battle, captives could be marched to the rear. In a lightning advance like the Ardennes offensive, prisoners became a problem. They required guards. They consumed time. They threatened security if left unattended. Doctrine did not provide clear answers. That ambiguity was compounded by the chain of command structure within Kampfgruppen. These ad hoc formations were assembled for speed and flexibility, often combining units that had not trained together. Command authority was real but fluid. Responsibility was dispersed. Orders passed verbally, sometimes indirectly, sometimes not at all. This created a dangerous environment where decisive action was praised, but restraint was not clearly enforced. Overlaying all of this was the speed over law mentality of the Ardennes offensive itself. The entire operation rested on tempo. Every hour mattered. Every delay increased the risk of Allied air power returning, of fuel shortages crippling the advance, of resistance hardening. Within that framework, the laws of war were not explicitly rejected, but they were deprioritized. Prisoners slowed momentum. Momentum was everything. When ideology teaches that the enemy is not merely opposing forces but an existential threat, legal protections begin to feel optional. When commanders are rewarded for speed and punished for hesitation, moral considerations become obstacles. This is where battlefield stress intersects with ideological conditioning. Stress alone does not produce atrocities. Armies have fought under extreme stress for centuries without systematically murdering prisoners. What turns pressure into crime is belief. Belief that certain people are undeserving of protection, belief that rules no longer apply, belief that survival or victory justifies any action. The SS had spent years cultivating exactly those beliefs. In contrast, Allied forces approached prisoners of war very differently. American doctrine emphasized the rapid removal of captives from the front lines, standardized reporting, and clear responsibility. Soldiers were trained, repeatedly, that prisoners were no longer combatants. Killing them was not only illegal, but counterproductive. This did not mean Allied forces never committed crimes. But it did mean that violations were deviations from doctrine, not expressions of it. At Malmedy, the SS system offered no such break. There was no moment where an officer was forced to stop and consider legal consequence. No standing order that demanded prisoners be protected regardless of inconvenience. No cultural reflex that prioritized restraint over speed. Instead, there was silence. And in that silence, initiative became permission. The massacre did not require an explicit command to kill. It required only the absence of a command to protect. Once the first shots were fired, the structure ensured escalation rather than correction. Subordinates followed the example set. Responsibility dissolved into collective action. Afterward, the same system that enabled the crime obscured accountability. Orders were unwritten. Authority was diffuse. Memory became selective. This is why Malmedy cannot be explained as spontaneous rage or battlefield confusion. It was the logical outcome of a command culture that valued results over restraint, initiative over law, and obedience over conscience. A system that removed friction between decision and action, but also removed safeguards against atrocity. In the frozen field near Malmedy, the technology was simple: rifles, machine guns, trucks. The tactics were mundane: capture, guard, movement. What failed was not equipment or training. What failed was the system designed to control power under pressure. And when systems fail at that level, the consequences are not accidents. They are crimes. The effects of Malmedy did not remain confined to the snow near the Bognes crossroads. They moved outward, through rumor, testimony, and fear, altering behavior on both sides of the front in ways that would shape the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge. Survivors reached American lines in fragments. Some arrived hours later, half-frozen and bleeding. Others were found days afterward, wandering through woods or collapsing at aid stations with stories that seemed, at first, almost unbelievable. But the details were consistent. The surrender. The waiting. The gunfire. The deliberate killing of wounded men. Words spread quickly. In a war already defined by exhaustion and cold, Malmedy injected something new: doubt. For American soldiers facing the Waffen-SS, the question of surrender became fraught. The assumption that capture meant survival could no longer be taken for granted. In briefings, in foxholes, and along frozen roads, soldiers repeated what they had heard. They shoot prisoners. This belief hardened attitudes with alarming speed. Units encountering SS formations became more aggressive. Offers of surrender were viewed with suspicion. Firefights that might once have ended with capture increasingly ended with annihilation. The spiral was not ordered from above, it emerged organically from fear. Malmedy had altered the psychological terrain of the battlefield. German forces felt the change as well. SS units captured in the days and weeks after the massacre encountered American soldiers who were wary, angry, and unwilling to take chances. Some prisoners were treated harshly. Others were quickly separated and interrogated. The moral damage inflicted by the massacre now returned, magnified, upon those who had not participated in it. This was not justice. It was consequence. Meanwhile, Allied command responded in a different way. Investigators were dispatched. Statements were collected. Photographs were taken. The massacre was not dismissed as a wartime rumor or propaganda opportunity. It was treated as evidence. Within days, Malmedy was no longer just a battlefield incident. It was a case. As the Battle of the Bulge ground on, the German offensive lost momentum. Fuel shortages crippled armored units. American resistance stiffened. The weather cleared, and Allied aircraft returned to the skies. The grand gamble collapsed into retreat. But Malmedy followed the retreating forces. When SS units were captured later in the war, particularly those associated with the Ardennes, Allied interrogators were no longer dealing with anonymous prisoners. Names mattered. Units mattered. Locations mattered. The massacre had created a paper trail that would not fade. Operationally, the massacre also exposed a critical flaw in German command philosophy. By prioritizing speed and aggression above all else, SS commanders had undermined the very objectives they sought to achieve. The killing of prisoners did not save time in any meaningful sense. It did not preserve fuel. It did not break Allied resistance. Instead, it stiffened it. American soldiers who might have hesitated now fought harder. Units that might have surrendered now held ground longer. The psychological advantage the Germans hoped to gain through shock was reversed. Fear became resolve. In this way, Malmedy stands as an operational failure as much as a moral one. The SS doctrine that encouraged initiative without restraint proved incapable of controlling escalation. What began as a decision intended to maintain momentum instead created a cascade of consequences that damaged German forces at every level: tactical, operational, and strategic. There were other incidents during the Ardennes offensive, smaller, less documented, equally brutal. But Malmedy became the reference point. It was the incident everyone knew about. The one with survivors. The one with photographs. The one that could not be denied. It shaped how Allied commanders thought about the SS. It shaped how soldiers behaved in the field. And it shaped how justice would later be pursued. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Malmedy was already part of the historical record. Investigators had assembled files thick with testimony. Survivors were prepared to speak. The names of officers and units were known. The battlefield phase of the story was over. The legal phase was about to begin. But even before the trials, the massacre had already delivered its verdict on the system that produced it. It demonstrated, in the most concrete way possible, that command cultures built on ideology and speed without restraint do not merely risk failure, they guarantee it. In the Ardennes, the SS sought to win through shock, aggression, and fear. Instead, they revealed the limits of those tools. Malmedy did not help Germany win the Battle of the Bulge. It did not shorten the war. It did not achieve any strategic objective. What it did was ensure that the war would end not only with defeat, but with judgment. And that judgment would reach far beyond the men who fired the weapons, into the command structures, doctrines, and beliefs that had made the massacre possible in the first place. By the time the bodies were discovered in the snow near Malmedy, the outcome of the war was no longer truly in doubt. What remained uncertain was only how long Germany could continue fighting, and how much destruction would be inflicted before the end came. The massacre occurred at a moment when Germany was already strategically exhausted. The Ardennes offensive was not a campaign of strength. It was a gamble born of weakness. Germany lacked fuel, lacked reserves, and lacked the industrial capacity to replace what it lost. The offensive depended on speed because it had no depth. Once momentum stalled, there was nothing behind it. This is where Malmedy becomes more than a moral crime. It becomes a strategic symptom. The Waffen-SS was expected to compensate for material shortages with aggression. Where Germany no longer had numbers, it relied on shock. Where it lacked fuel, it relied on fear. Where it lacked time, it relied on ruthlessness. But brutality is not a substitute for production. Across the Atlantic, the United States was operating on an entirely different scale. American factories ran uninterrupted. Rail networks stretched coast to coast, untouched by bombing. Training camps produced soldiers faster than Germany could replace its losses. Equipment flowed in quantities that made individual losses survivable. This imbalance shaped everything. American soldiers captured in the Ardennes came from an army backed by enormous logistical depth. Even under surprise attack, they could fall back, regroup, and counterattack. German units, by contrast, were fighting with shrinking margins. Every destroyed vehicle mattered. Every lost tank was irreplaceable. Every delay threatened collapse. In that context, the killing of prisoners at Malmedy revealed a fatal misunderstanding of power. Germany believed terror could compensate for scarcity. That fear could force surrender, slow resistance, and buy time. But the reality was the opposite. Atrocities hardened resolve. They confirmed Allied narratives about the SS. They justified total commitment to victory. Strategically, Malmedy achieved nothing. It did not preserve fuel. It did not speed the advance. It did not secure a single bridge or depot. What it did was deepen Allied determination and reinforce the moral clarity of the war and its final months. For the United States and its allies, the massacre became another reminder of what they were fighting against, and why compromise was impossible. Meanwhile, Germany's inability to control its own forces revealed a deeper collapse. Command authority fractured under pressure. Doctrine failed to adapt. Ideology replaced strategy. The SS, once touted as an elite instrument of power, became a liability, undisciplined, brutal, and strategically counterproductive. By early 1945, the imbalance was overwhelming. American divisions rotated through the front with fresh equipment and replacements. German units shrank, filled with inexperienced troops and exhausted veterans. Fuel shortages immobilized armor. Air superiority became absolute. The Ardennes offensive, once envisioned as a turning point, became Germany's last major gamble, and its last major failure. Malmedy, in this sense, stands as a stark contrast between two systems. One system relied on ideology, intimidation, and obedience without restraint. It consumed itself under pressure. The other relied on production, logistics, and institutional discipline. It absorbed shock and continued forward. The massacre did not alter the strategic outcome of the war, but it illuminated it. It showed that Germany was no longer fighting from a position of strength, but from desperation. And desperate systems often abandon law, not because they are cruel by nature, but because they are losing control. In the end, the war would not be decided by fields in Belgium or by columns racing through forests. It would be decided by factories, supply lines, and the ability to sustain combat without surrendering moral authority. Malmedy stripped away any illusion that the SS represented disciplined military power. Instead, it exposed a force burning through its last reserves, of fuel, of manpower, and of legitimacy. And once legitimacy is gone, no amount of aggression can replace it. The snow near Malmedy melted in spring. The field returned to quiet. But the imbalance it revealed, between desperation and endurance, between terror and production, remained one of the defining truths of the war's final chapter. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the field near Malmedy did not fade into obscurity. Unlike many wartime atrocities lost in the chaos of collapsing fronts, this one had survivors. It had witnesses. It had evidence preserved by snow and time. And it demanded an answer. In the months after Germany's surrender, Allied investigators returned to the massacre with the patience and authority that war had denied them. Survivors gave sworn testimony. Local civilians spoke of what they had seen. Ballistics, photographs, and unit records were assembled into a case that left little room for doubt. This was not rumor. This was not propaganda. This was a documented crime. Those identified as responsible were arrested and brought before a military tribunal. For the first time, SS officers and men were forced to confront their actions not as soldiers under fire, but as defendants under law. The courtrooms were quiet places, far removed from the snow and gunfire of the Ardennes. Yet the decisions made there carried equal weight. Defenses were offered. Orders were cited. Confusion was claimed. Responsibility was shifted upward, downward, and sideways. Some argued that no explicit command to kill prisoners had been given. Others insisted they were merely following the momentum of battle. The tribunal rejected these arguments. The judgment was clear: surrender had been accepted, prisoners had been disarmed, and time had passed. What followed was deliberate killing. Obedience was not an excuse. Ideology was not a shield. War did not erase the law. Sentences were handed down. Some were severe. Some were later reduced. History would debate the fairness of certain procedures, but not the core conclusion. Malmedy was a war crime, and those responsible bore moral and legal guilt. For the survivors, justice did not erase memory. Many carried physical wounds for the rest of their lives. Others bore injuries that never appeared on medical records, nightmares, silence, a persistent distrust of the moment when violence seems to pause. Some spoke openly about what they endured. Others never spoke at all. The massacre shaped how they understood the war, and how they understood survival. For Germany, Malmedy became part of a broader reckoning. It stood alongside other crimes as evidence of what happens when ideology overrides restraint, and when institutions reward obedience without conscience. It forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths: that brutality had not been an accident, and that it had been enabled by command structures and belief systems. The field itself remained. No monument could restore what was lost there. But memory ensured that it would not disappear into abstraction. Malmedy became a reference point in military law, in ethical training, and in historical study, a case used not to sensationalize violence, but to prevent its repetition. Because the lesson of Malmedy is not confined to one war or one army. It is a warning about systems under pressure. About how quickly law erodes when speed becomes sacred. About how easily moral boundaries collapse when enemies are reduced to problems instead of people. The massacre was not the end of the story. It was the moment the war's moral cost became undeniable, etched into snow, preserved by testimony, and carried forward as a reminder that even in total war, some lines define whether humanity survives the fight. In the end, the field near Malmedy returned to silence. Snow melted. Grass grew back. Roads carried traffic again. To a passerby, it became just another quiet place in the Ardennes, indistinguishable from countless others shaped by the war. But history does not forget places where choices were made. The 84 American soldiers who stood there believed the fighting had ended for them. They believed surrender still meant something. Their deaths remind us that war does not only test weapons and tactics, it tests systems, values, and the limits of obedience. Malmedy was not inevitable. It was not written into fate or weather or chance. It happened because a command culture removed restraint, because ideology replaced law, and because initiative was allowed to operate without moral boundary. That is what makes it enduring. The massacre did not change the outcome of the war. Germany would still lose. The Allies would still advance. But Malmedy changed how the war was remembered, by exposing the cost of abandoning the rules meant to preserve a fragment of humanity amid destruction. History often asks us to focus on grand strategies and decisive battles. Malmedy asks something quieter and more difficult. It asks us to examine how ordinary decisions, made under pressure, can produce extraordinary harm when systems fail to protect the powerless. The legacy of that snowy field is not vengeance, nor hatred. It is responsibility. Responsibility to remember that power without restraint leads not to victory, but to judgment. Responsibility to teach that obedience is never absolute. And responsibility to ensure that surrender, one of the last hopes left in war, never becomes a death sentence again. Because when the rules vanish, it is not the enemy who is defeated. It is humanity itself.